Hello, everyone. I'm Jackie McGriff, and I'm a part of the Bid Education Committee. We have originally planned to present this information during a scheduled work session with Rochester City Council on March 25th of this year. Less than a week before, bid advocates announced that they were ending the bid formation process. We feel the information in this presentation deserves to be part of the public record, so we are making it available here. Who is the Bid Education Committee? We are a group of community members who are volunteering our time to educate ourselves and our communities about business improvement districts generally and the bid proposed for downtown Rochester in particular. Today, you will be hearing from myself, Kelly Cheadle, and Darian Lehman. Based on what we've learned, we are opposed to the creation of a bid in downtown. Since March 16th, 2023, 1,300 individuals and 30 plus community organizations have signed our petition calling on City Council to cease any further actions toward the creation of a downtown bid and invest instead in community-led, democratically accountable initiatives for downtown that prioritize equity and the needs of the many instead of the desires of the few. That petition was presented to City Council in August 2023. Since the Rochester Downtown Development Corporation's formal feedback and outreach process concluded in December 2023, over 40 street level small businesses and property owners in downtown, in whose name the bid had been pushed, signed on to an open letter calling on City Council to reject the proposed district plan, calling the feedback process flawed. That letter was read into record at City Council in February of this year. We believe the future of downtown is everyone's business. We believe the stakeholders in this conversation are not just the owners of the 600 plus properties in the proposed district. They are downtown residents, small business tenants, and thousands of city residents who use downtown. The root problem we're all trying to solve is generations of disinvestment from the city. The question is not whether we can do more downtown. The question is, what kind of downtown do we want? Who is downtown for? And who should get to decide? The current push to create a bid downtown is coordinated by a nonprofit organization known as the Rochester Downtown Development Corporation, or the RDDC. The RDDC would also be responsible for managing the bid. The RDDC was empowered by City Council in 2022 to draft a district plan and to oversee a community outreach process. It's important to note that the RDDC is a special interest group that represents some of the largest businesses and property owners in Rochester. They have been advocating for a downtown bid since at least 2013 to 2014, when it failed due to community concerns. Prior to that, they managed the Red Shirts Ambassador Program, which was also discontinued. As Susanna Schaller, professor of urban planning at CUNY, notes, for the last 30 years, bid advocates have engaged in effective and persuasive storytelling. As a result, many policymakers and planners perpetuate the bid narrative without examining the institution and the inequities it has wrought, as bid urbanism has oiled the urban gentrification machine. While the RDDC was conducting its selective outreach process, we reached out to a broader set of stakeholders, meeting with neighborhood associations, community organizations, and small business owners to come up with a community impact assessment for the proposed downtown bid. This presentation includes the top concerns we heard throughout that process. I will now hand it off to Kelly to talk about the implications for democracy.
Thank you, Jackie. One of the major issues with the Business Improvement District policy is its impact on local democracy. In the New Republic, investigative journalist Max Rivlin-Nadler describes bids as, quote, a concerted effort to further empower the powerful. In 2013, the previous director of the RDDC described this power shift as a benefit to the property owning members. Quote, formed outside of City Hall, property owners create bids to gain more control over their environment. As we'll highlight in this section, bids have serious implications for democracy. We'll analyze key sections of the draft bid plan with respect to bid formation, assessment, board composition, and lobbying. Creating a bid in New York State does not require a public vote. It does, however, require the support of 51% of property owners within the proposed district. That's 51% by parcel count and 51% by parcel value. On its face, this is wildly undemocratic. Decision-making power under this model is directly tied to property ownership, namely one parcel, one vote, and $1, one vote. The bid was advertised as benefiting street-level small businesses, most of whom rent, but tenants are cut out of this process and do not get a formal say. Unlike municipal voting based on residency in a district, residential tenants downtown are completely cut out. It's even unclear whether all property owners in the proposed district would even be consulted, since the RDDC could stop petitioning once they reached their 51% threshold. Given the dual criteria of one property, one vote, and $1, one vote, it's important to ask, who has the biggest say in this decision? Who would have the biggest stake in the bid? Here's a list of the top 10 property owners under each criteria. You'll notice developers and big corporations top both of these lists. These are the exact types of owners that the RDDC represents. And in fact, nearly this entire board has formal representation on the RDDC's board, the board that is pushing for the creation of a bid. That is in their interest. Do they really represent the community at large? It's not just the bid formation process that's weighted in favor of the largest property owners. According to New York state law, the bid board itself must have a majority of property owners and majority rules. The interests of property owners, especially large developers, are often in direct conflict with those of other downtown stakeholders who are not adequately represented in the required bid structure. Susanna Schaller, professor of urban studies and planning at CUNY, explains, quote, landlord and tenant interests do not always coincide, especially where a strategic measure of bid effectiveness, the pursuit of higher property values and lease rates, is concerned. Consequently, bid properties do not necessarily reflect the needs of tenant businesses. Additionally, landlord interests may not overlap either, as large property investors are in a position to crowd out or buy smaller owners. Darian's going to take it from here.
Thanks, Kelly. So bid advocates often say that bids are a way for property owners to voluntarily pitch in for improvements to the district. Yet, as we can see from this slide, the additional tax, if approved by 51% of petitionees, would be imposed on all ratepayers within the district. And this rate is a starting point. Not only will the dollar amount paid by each property owner increase in future years as assessed property value increases, bid boards can and do vote to approve higher rates. And as we'll discuss later, this increased cost will almost certainly be passed on to small business tenants and renters, some of whom can least afford it. Another important point to note about assessments here: properties owned by city, county, state, or federal government will pay at the same rate as these big property owners and corporations. In fact, according to an analysis by Rochester Beacon, the city of Rochester would be the largest individual payee to the bid, contributing $350,000 for its 63 properties downtown. This amounts to an indirect tax on all city taxpayers who have no meaningful way of shaping a bid's priorities or activities. We see this $350,000 as a public subsidy to these private interests listed here, which will have a controlling stake on the board as per New York state law. Now, if we add in all county, state, and federal parcels in the district to those of the city, then the percentage of bid revenue coming from public sources rises to 23%. For context, that puts the downtown Rochester bid proposal at the upper end of this list of bids studied by UC Berkeley Law for the percentage of bid revenue from public sources. This is admittedly a limited sample, but one of a few such studies of bids that is publicly accessible. That same study from UC Berkeley Law drew on a survey of 189 bids across 69 cities, and it found that many bids not only spend this public money on things like beautification and sanitation as advertised, but also on policy advocacy. Nearly half of respondents said policy advocacy was one of their main expenditures, and sometimes this was listed as part of a communications budget. We'll talk later about the kinds of policies many bids advocate for, but we have to ask here, are these activities we want public money funding? So some of the takeaways from this section: the bid petitioning process per New York State law excludes all stakeholders who don't own property downtown. Second, the bid board structure per New York State law is weighted to give majority control to property owners whose interests are often in conflict with those of other stakeholders. And finally, the bid assessment formula uses public money to subsidize the activities of a privately controlled entity, and those activities often include policy advocacy. So those are our implications for democracy. And here I'll pass it back to Jackie.
Thanks, Darian. Some of the most concerning implications of a downtown bid are its potential economic and social impacts. As Susanna Schaller writes, bids do not simply manage the clean and safe programs or other supposedly supplemental services as advertised. In reality, bid policy entrepreneurs shape broader policy discussions and urban redevelopment plans that spur multiple forms of displacement: political, economic, cultural, and ultimately physical. In this section, we'll focus in on increased costs to renters, displacement, criminalization of poverty, and the use of social services in so-called therapeutic policing. It's standard practice in both commercial and residential leases to pass increased costs onto tenants in the form of higher rents. It's safe to assume that this would be the case with an additional bid fee. Many downtown small businesses told us that cost increases represented an existential threat to their livelihoods. Recent data from Hood, Act Rochester, and RMAPI suggest that additional increases in the cost of housing, especially downtown, would have a major impact on residential tenants as well. According to Hood figures, fair market rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Rochester is $1,050 in 2024, a 30% increase since 2020. A recent study by Act Rochester found that 53% of local renters are rent burdened, paying at least 30% of their income for housing. Residents of color are disproportionately impacted by rising rent, since a disproportionate number live in poverty. Hood figures suggest homelessness is on the rise in Rochester, with over 800 homeless people, 30% of them children, counted on a single night in 2023, a 7% increase from 2022. Against this backdrop of Rochester's housing affordability crisis, what would rent increases from a new bid fee and rising property assessments mean for downtown? This graphic from Rochester Beacon for 2011 to 2021 suggests that demographic displacement may already be underway. It shows the white population has grown the most over the last 10 years, while the Black population has decreased. This side-by-side comparison of downtown's demographics with the demographics of the city as a whole shows that downtown as a residential neighborhood is already not representative of the city overall. A bid would most likely accelerate this trend by making rent more unaffordable downtown. Rochester is not the only city facing displacement by gentrification. Washington, D.C. requires that legislation go through a racial equity impact assessment conducted by the City Council's Office of Racial Equity. Wouldn't it be amazing if Rochester had this? In reviewing a proposal to create a new bid in the Friendship Heights neighborhood, the office found the following. The Friendship Heights bid would expand a bid system that has contributed to the displacement of Black residents, does not offer Black residents and other residents of color equal opportunities to represent their interests, has a broad authority to exercise power over communities with little accountability to everyone impacted, and primarily serves the interests of wealthier white residents at the expense of Black and other residents of color who are unhoused or have lower incomes. I'll be passing this off to Darian, who will elaborate on displacement, criminalization of poverty, and therapeutic policing.
Thanks, Jackie. So given our community's existing challenges with housing affordability, rising assessments, and homelessness, we are particularly concerned with how a bid might exacerbate these issues indirectly, but also through the criminalization of poverty, through selective policing of public space. We know that one key issue for bids nationwide is the issue of homelessness, which is typically approached from a safety and security perspective rather than from a housing perspective. We talked earlier about bids as lobbying organizations, and the study we mentioned, conducted by UC Berkeley Law, found a strong correlation between the number of new bids in California after 1994 and the number of new anti-homeless ordinances passed at the local level. Bids frequently advocate for anti-homeless measures, using public resources to pay their staff to testify at City Hall or to issue press statements. Bids not only advocate for these kinds of laws, they also help to enforce them. The study found 90% of bids surveyed worked with police to enforce anti-homeless laws, and 68% reported using some kind of security. The study's authors concluded that this approach to what is in fact a housing crisis only exacerbates the problem by criminalizing poverty and moving it out of sight. They also noted that enforcement was often based on a person's status rather than behavior, and we would say that the potential danger here extends beyond the unhoused to other vulnerable populations using downtown as well, including young people and poor people. And on this note, there are a few particularly perverse examples that maybe are outliers in the world of bids, but we wanted to highlight one here just to show how bids left to their own devices can create the conditions for tremendous corruption and abuse. One business improvement district in Portland, Oregon, known there as Enhanced Services Districts, funded staffers at a community court, a court which enforces quality of life violations. That court in turn sentenced defendants to cleaning labor in the bid. And according to Teen Vogue, who did an investigation into this issue, they valued the expense of that labor over 10 years at roughly $1 million. Now, RDDC has gone out of its way in the bid proposal to emphasize that its so-called hospitality ambassadors will, quote, not be a security team. Now, setting aside for the moment that this is at best a kind of out of touch and expensive branding exercise that I'm pretty sure most city residents who go to downtown frequently are not asking for, let's look at RDDC's own record and at some of RDDC's statements about the value of putting some of these ambassadors in downtown. So back in 2013, the RDDC's previous bid proposal said one of its goals was to, quote, control undesirable street activity, youth, panhandlers, etc., using police, enhanced on-street security resources, and creative behavioral redirection programs. At around the same time, the RDDC was responsible for managing what's known as the Red Shirts program. Councilmember Carolee Conklin, who was at the time the chair of the Finance Committee, explained to the Democrat and Chronicle in 2015 when council decided not to continue the program. She said the Red Shirts was, quote, a taxpayer subsidy of a service which became pretty much a private security service for downtown. Now, fast forwarding to more recently in this latest bid push, in 2022, Chamber of Commerce CEO Bob Duffy identified the perception of safety as a critical need a bid could address. And he said on the Chamber's blog, quote, red shirts are being discussed to come back through the bid. I would support that. And finally, in 2023, Don Jeffries, the CEO of Visit Rochester, pitched the ambassador program to the county's Comida board, saying, quote, "There will be direct contact from these people to the police," end quote. Now, we don't have to assume that RDDC, in drafting this and saying the hospitality ambassadors would not be a security force, we don't have to assume that they're lying. But if BID members and powerful individuals like these mentioned here decide in future years they want a security force, what do we really think will happen? Now, one of the contradictions of business improvement districts is that advocating for and enforcing anti-homeless laws is not mutually exclusive with working with social service providers. And this contradiction is captured by the term therapeutic policing, which is typically designed to push homeless people into social services and often out of sight and out of the BID district. The BID's draft budget proposed directing a small 7% of its revenue toward two different social service agencies in Rochester, recognizing that the BID would be calling on these agencies to increase their services. And they say here that the funding was intended to, quote, "focus the time and efforts of those staff members." So we feel that the fact that property owners and business owners might be in the position of shaping the type of social services available to our city's most vulnerable residents, we find that troubling. And we aren't the only ones. REACH is a community-based organization that provides social services and engages in housing advocacy in Rochester. While REACH was initially identified by the RDDC as one of the community-based organizations to receive the BID social services supplement, this letter, dated February 24th, 2024, shows that REACH had some serious concerns about the impact of a BID on the city's unhoused citizens, naming the proposed ambassador programs as one particular cause for concern. And here I'll hand it back to Kelly.
Downtown already has, Thanks, Darian. Downtown already has a downtown enhancement district, where an additional tax assessment is collected from adjacent properties for additional services. Run by the City of Rochester, it employs 11 maintenance workers who provide additional cleaning, maintenance, beautification, and holiday decoration services backed by the AFSCME bargaining unit. Most BIDs offer similar enhanced cleaning and beautification services as part of the reason to create them. Despite declarations otherwise, this offering would duplicate existing services and potentially violate the Public Employees Fair Employment Act, which is also commonly referred to as Taylor Law. When ambassador service was put forward last summer ahead of the BID legislation, this potential violation of Taylor was brought to the attention of council and city administration in a letter from Mike Rivera of AFSCME Local 1635. In response, the RDDC suggests in their district plan that these ambassadors could unionize if they wanted to. This demonstrates a clear lack of understanding and fails to address the core concerns of labor, leaving the city at risk for a lawsuit. So our takeaways from this section: the additional BID tax, together with tax increases resulting from rising property value assessments, will result in increased costs to property owners that will be passed on to commercial and residential tenants, exacerbating existing inequities. Downtown is becoming increasingly unrepresentative of the city as a whole. A BID is unlikely to reverse this trend. BIDs nationwide use public funds to advocate for and enforce anti-homeless laws that disproportionately impact and criminalize vulnerable populations. The BID threatens the employment of union-backed city maintenance workers and a potential lawsuit for violating the Public Employees Fair Employment Act. Some final thoughts. Since the beginning of this public push for a BID, the administration has treated the BID as a done deal. Mayor Malik Evans said, "You have to have pro-BID and anti-BID at the same table shaping the BID." There was never an opportunity to just say no. It's clear that these plans for a business improvement district were made for the community and not with it. This has been an undemocratic process from the beginning. Community stakeholders were not engaged and not empowered to vote. By design, a bid would consolidate power of a handful of property owners whose interests are often in conflict with those of small business tenants, renters, and other city residents. It would worsen existing inequities in our community through gentrification, likely accelerating economic and social inequality. And finally, the bid is just simply unnecessary. Thank you for your time.